Canada is built on the dispossession of Indigenous lands. To envision a better future, we must explore and acknowledge our collective histories and ask ourselves, how does this future build on the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples and their long-standing governance of their territories?
Non-Indigenous people need to educate themselves on the history of colonization in this country and on Indigenous governance and justice. That education is essential to being able to be in good relation and act in ethical ways in relation to Indigenous people.
I think there's so much to understand about the histories, and I'm saying histories as plural, of Canada in terms of Indigenous relations with land and sort of colonial imposition of systems of land taking. This idea that somehow Canada became part of Britain, that the Crown could assume sovereignty within Indigenous territories where there were already sovereign people within those territories, is the basis of how we understand Canadian law and Canadian property law. So all of these property interests that everyone has are based on this idea that there was no one in this territory and that it was discovered. And we know that to be factually incorrect.
We have to remember that the lands were systematically stolen from Indigenous people. And it started when, of course, the French and the British started to lay claim on these lands. They started to lay their flags on these lands and started to assume title over them. And that was all through the doctrine of discovery, which basically was, if you could go out there and find lands that didn't have Christians, you could take their lands.
The crisis in the present is based on the injustice of how this country was first confederated. 89% of the lands in this country have been designated as Crown or public lands, roughly divided between federal and provincial governments. That claim to underlying title by the Crown of Indigenous lands is the foundation for the relationship of domination between the Crown and Indigenous people in Canada. So at the time of the British North America Act, all jurisdictional powers were divided between the federal and provincial governments, and there was no role for First Nations or Indigenous people more generally to play in the jurisdiction and governance of their lands.
We weren't involved in Confederation, which is a fundamental failing of ultimately democracy on this place. And it means that Canada, you know, as a sort of legal entity, has a pretty specious claim on this territory, right? Its claim is really one of occupancy.
How are we any different than an occupying army or an occupying force if we're on lands for which we have no consent to be here, unless we do learn about what the consent protocols are to be here in a good way and to live in relation to Indigenous law and governance?
If we look at the British North American Act, if you actually read the text of it, it's basically setting up a corporation, not a country, right? An extractionist corporation that's meant to take the resources from this land and export them to Europe. That's literally the origins of this country. And truthfully, what we need is for Canada itself to recognize that the path it's chosen won't actually resolve what it's after either, which is its own sovereignty. That Canada can never be a sovereign nation unless it understands our sovereignty.
Canada is a nation whose wealth comes from the land and waters. But then why are the people who cared for the land for thousands of years the poorest among us? Much of Canada is designated Crown land, when in fact it is Indigenous land.
A lot of people see Mother Earth as like an object, the earth, the water, the air, not as a spirit.
There's the possibility then, though, to misunderstand this idea of not owning land as being somehow okay with the idea that it's up to be taken by others. I think that's an interesting starting point for the discussion, is that idea of ownership being the wrong framework. If there were no treaties, there's no rightful way for people to be within our territories. The treaties that we made were agreements to share in the resources and share in the territory in ways that were respectful of Indigenous jurisdiction and maintaining Indigenous jurisdiction over time. That's not the reality of how treaties have been implemented in Canada, and I think the Crown has a very skewed view of what treaties are meant to achieve.
The way that the Crown interpreted those treaties, though, was gradually over time to diminish the governance role of Indigenous people through the treaty process and to minimize them as basically contractual agreements that over the years became smaller and smaller and smaller rights to their lands, resources, and territories.
The way that land management has been created was from colonial property law. I mean, that was the whole intention, was to erase us as a people.
So the Canadian state is a very complex concept, especially in relation to what we'll call natural resources. There's this devolution from Canada to provinces of these natural resources and lands within the province, all under this guise of the Crown, like this magic hat of the Crown.
If you talk to treaty rights holders across the country, they don't consider their lands to be ceded. Indigenous people did not cede or surrender their lands. They agreed to share jurisdiction with the state under particular circumstances.
I think if our ancestors looked at where we are today, they wouldn't understand this. This is not what they imagined. They thought we could live together. And so in that spirit, that's sort of how I approach all these things too, is that that's living true to what they imagined.
When Canada formed and became its own country, they created something called the Indian Act, which was to force people off their traditional lands, have them contained onto the reservations, and then filtered into colonization so that they would never ever become a threat to resource extraction. Because Canada had a mandate for a free-for-all in resource extraction. You know, before that, we had our own sustainable economies on the land, we had our own governments, we had our own laws, and that we're an Indigenous species in our ecosystems. And it was very pivotal for the Canadian government to remove us from the ecology because we're the natural land protectors. We're the natural water protectors because our cultural history is embedded right into the very land itself. When we were removed, it caused like a domino effect. And it allowed the resource extraction to take place, which is now causing an ecological collapse.
When those colonial laws, especially the Indian Act, came into place, you know, it was a total erasure of the role that Indigenous women have had to be decision makers. The creation of reservations was outside of that original, even treaty relationships, if there was a treaty. All of a sudden we have these little squares of land under the Indian Act. And when I think of reservations, I think of cages, I think of animal reservations. Let's cage people up.
Looking at it from a time in which dozens of Indigenous nations were allied with Great Britain during the American Revolution and then subsequent to that, the War of 1812. And at that time, the Indigenous nations were utilizing their full agency as sovereign nations in their negotiations and relations with the Crown. After their usefulness was done, Indigenous peoples were sort of swept aside. Around 1830, when those policies went from one of respecting the nationhood of First Nations to treating them as wards of the emerging Canadian government. And those policies that emerged were paternalistic policies and policies designed to essentially dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands and resources. That's sort of the quick summation of Canadian history.
As an Indigenous person, I don't get my rights from the treaty. I have inherent Anishinaabeg responsibilities on these lands.
Our history as Haudenosaunee peoples, as Ongwahoweh, as Indigenous peoples, goes way back a long time before Canada ever existed. So now we're dealing, with that historical violent relationship and having to deal with a whole framework, a whole society that's been built on colonial law.
I think it would be a collective societal and environmental mistake not to rely on the wisdom of nations that have been in connection with territory for thousands of years.
And I go right back to the two-row. The whole intention was for us to live together. Our laws are always about that responsibility or relationships, reciprocity. It isn't until we bring in the colonial law that all of a sudden we're talking about rights. And even the whole concept of rights was also based on an individual. That isn't how we think of things. It isn't just about me. It's about my responsibility to all of the above. My family, my clan, my community, my nation.
If you have somebody that has a right to that glass of water, and then you have somebody else that has a right to that glass of water, and you have somebody else that has a right to that glass of water, it becomes a conflict. But when you have three people that are responsible for that glass of water, it changes the whole narrative. It changes the whole feeling.
Everyone talks about their rights, but in Anishinaabe, we talk about our responsibilities. My responsibility to the waters, I'm born into that responsibility being Anishinaabe Kwe. It's my obligation to protect water.
That was our teachings, that you actually see the faces of our children in the land. And if you see the faces of the children in your land, it's alive.